You didn't see it coming. That's the part that still replays in your head. There were no loud arguments that felt final, no dramatic exits, no slammed doors, just subtle shifts, a slower reply, a colder tone, a strange emotional distance that crept in like fog. One day you were laughing, planning, sharing vulnerability, and the next you felt like a stranger standing outside a locked door. And then it happened. They moved in a way that felt slick, strategic, almost rehearsed. They didn't just leave, they repositioned. Maybe there was someone new already lined up. Maybe there was a narrative prepared about why you were too much or why they needed peace. Maybe they painted themselves as overwhelmed while quietly erasing you. It felt like being snaked, like someone you trusted, studied your heart just long enough to know exactly where to strike. But here's what they didn't expect. They didn't expect you to survive it without collapsing. They didn't expect you to process it without chasing. They didn't expect your silence to be stronger than their exit. And that's where this story really begins, because what felt like betrayal was actually a test of emotional power, and they miscalculated. You have to understand something about avoidant energy. It rarely explodes, it withdraws, it doesn't scream, it strategizes. Long before you noticed anything was wrong, something was shifting internally for them. The connection was getting deeper. The conversations were getting more honest. You were seeing parts of them that most people never see. Their fears, their childhood wounds, their insecurities about not being enough. And that depth, it activated something they weren't prepared to handle. Avoidants don't run from people, they run from vulnerability. When intimacy starts feeling real, their nervous system reads it as danger. So instead of communicating fear, they create distance. They pull back emotionally first. They reduce affection, they become busy, distracted, harder to read. And while you were trying to understand the shift, they were already building their exit ramp. That's why it feels like you were blindsided, because while you were still investing, they were quietly detaching. They thought they were 10 steps ahead. They thought you wouldn't notice until it was too late, and in some ways they were right. You didn't notice immediately, but what they didn't expect was that once you did notice, you wouldn't respond the way others had before. The quiet exit strategy is never chaotic, it's controlled. They don't want confrontation because confrontation requires emotional accountability. So instead of saying, I'm scared of how close this is getting, they say, I just need space. Instead of admitting, I'm overwhelmed by how much this matters, they say, I'm not sure I'm ready. And the most painful part? Sometimes they overlap connections, not always physically, but emotionally. They start entertaining new attention before fully releasing you. It gives them a safety net. It protects their ego. It ensures they're never alone long enough to feel the full weight of loss. To you, it feels like betrayal. To them, it feels like survival. But survival at your expense still cuts deep because you were genuine, you were transparent, you weren't calculating your next move while holding their hand, you were present. And when someone moves in silence while you're moving in sincerity, the impact is brutal. They thought the quiet fade would confuse you enough to keep you chasing clarity. They expected emotional chaos from you. They expected tears, long messages, attempts to fix what they had already decided to abandon. That expectation is rooted in their past patterns. It has worked before. People usually chase avoidance. People usually try to prove their worth. But this time, something shifted. Why did they snake you? That question keeps circling your mind. Was it intentional? Was it malicious? Or was it fear disguised as indifference? The truth is uncomfortable. It wasn't about you being unworthy, it was about you being too real. You were stepping into spaces in their heart that required them to show up consistently, and consistency demands emotional availability. The more you showed up, the more exposed they felt. When someone is used to shallow connections, depth feels suffocating. When someone is used to control, equality feels destabilizing. You weren't hard to love. You were hard to avoid. Your presence required growth, and growth feels like threat to someone who survives by staying guarded. So instead of rising to meet the connection, they lowered the connection to meet their comfort zone. They convinced themselves you were asking for too much, that your needs were excessive, that your desire for clarity was pressure. It's easier to label someone demanding than to admit you're emotionally unequipped. And when they started feeling that internal pressure, the easiest solution was distance. Not conversation, not compromise, distance. It feels like betrayal because they didn't communicate the fear driving their behavior. They just shifted roles and made you the villain in a story you didn't even know was being rewritten. They thought you were easy to replace. That's the part that stings. Not because you are replaceable, but because they treated the connection like it was interchangeable. Avoidants often believe emotional bonds can be swapped out when they become inconvenient. If it gets uncomfortable, detach. If it gets deep, distract. If it requires effort, downgrade. So when they pulled away, they likely told themselves that someone else would be simpler, less intense, less emotionally demanding, someone who wouldn't challenge their walls, someone who wouldn't see through their patterns. They underestimated what you brought to the table: emotional safety, patience, insight. You weren't just affection, you were understanding. And understanding is rare. They assumed you would remain available while they tested other waters. They assumed your heart would stay parked where they left it. That's the miscalculation. Because while they were trying to prove to themselves that you were replaceable, you were learning that access to you is not guaranteed. You began seeing the dynamic clearly. You started connecting the dots, the mixed signals, the half efforts, the emotional withholding. And instead of fighting harder, something inside you grew quieter, stronger, more observant. They expected you to chase. Let's be honest, that expectation wasn't random. It was based on history. Maybe others had begged before, maybe silence from them had always triggered pursuit. Avoidants are accustomed to being the one who withdraws while the other person leans in harder. It feeds a sense of control. It reinforces the belief that they are the emotionally independent one. So when they executed their exit, there was likely an assumption you would panic. You would demand explanations. You would try to fix what they had already mentally ended. They expected long paragraphs and emotional appeals. They expected tears. They expected you to convince them to stay. Because when someone chases you, it confirms your value without requiring you to be vulnerable. But you didn't. Or maybe you did at first. Maybe you asked questions. Maybe you sought clarity. But when you felt the wall, you stopped pushing. That's the part they didn't expect. Your restraint, your dignity, your ability to sit in pain without performing it publicly for their validation. Instead of chasing, you processed. Instead of begging, you reflected. Instead of collapsing, you recalibrated. And that shift changed the entire dynamic. Because when an avoidant pulls away expecting pursuit and receives composure instead, something destabilizes internally. The narrative breaks. They no longer feel ahead of the story. They start wondering, did it not matter? Are you already over it? Did they misjudge your attachment? The irony is heavy. The same distance they created to feel safe now feels uncertain. They wanted space without consequence. They didn't expect space to create growth on your end. They didn't expect you to start reclaiming energy, to redirect focus, to glow differently. And while they may not admit it out loud, the absence of your reaction speaks volumes. You didn't chase, you observed, you didn't collapse, you evolved. And that evolution is what they never planned for. They thought snaking you would secure their emotional advantage. They didn't realize it would expose their fear. And this is only the beginning of what unfolds when someone underestimates the strength of the heart they tried to outmaneuver. And this is only the beginning of what unfolds when someone underestimates the strength of the heart they tried to outmaneuver, because what happens next is something avoidants rarely prepare for. When they pull away, they expect relief, they expect to feel lighter, in control, unburdened by emotional responsibility. And at first they might. The silence feels peaceful, the distance feels empowering. They convince themselves they made the right decision. They tell themselves it wasn't that deep, that they're fine, that you're fine. But what they don't understand is that suppression has a delay. Avoidant emotions don't disappear, they get postponed. And when they resurface, they hit harder because there's no one there to cushion the fall. That's when the emotional crash begins. It doesn't happen immediately. It creeps in quietly. Maybe it's triggered by a memory, a song, a place, a late night thought when distractions fade. Maybe it's seeing you no longer reaching out. Maybe it's realizing your energy isn't orbiting them anymore. The nervous system that once felt overwhelmed by closeness now feels unsettled by absence. The very safety they pushed away starts to feel irreplaceable. They replay conversations. They remember the way you listened without judgment, the way you understood their silence without demanding constant explanation. the way you held space when they struggled to articulate emotions, and the weight of what they lost begins to press against the walls they built. But here's the part they won't show publicly: the ego doesn't allow visible regret. So the crash happens internally, in private, behind composed faces and curated appearances. They act unbothered, but something is shifting underneath. When avoidants feel that internal shift, they don't immediately reach out, they observe quietly, from a distance. They start watching you in ways that don't require vulnerability. Social media becomes a window. Mutual connections become sources of indirect information. They don't want to break their pride, but they want data. Are you moving on? Are you thriving? Are you hurting? Because if you're still hurting, it confirms their narrative, that you were more attached than they were. But if you look peaceful, grounded, evolving, that destabilizes everything. It forces them to confront a reality they didn't plan for. You weren't destroyed. You weren't frozen in grief. You adapted. An adaptation from someone they assumed would chase feels like rejection. Not loud rejection, not dramatic rejection, but emotional independence. And nothing unsettles an avoidant more than realizing they are no longer the emotional center of someone they left. Then comes the comparison phase. It's subtle at first. Maybe they start seeing someone new. Maybe they're already entertaining attention. On the surface, it looks like they upgraded, like they replaced you effortlessly. But depth cannot be manufactured overnight. Emotional safety cannot be replicated instantly. The new connection might feel lighter, easier, less demanding. But ease is not the same as depth, and that difference becomes clearer with time. Conversations feel surface level. Vulnerability feels limited. There's less emotional intensity, which once felt overwhelming, but now feels empty. And that's when the comparison begins. Not because they want to admit you were special, but because their nervous system remembers what authentic connection felt like. They start noticing the absence of what you provided naturally, the way you anticipated emotional shifts, the way you read between the lines, the way you offered reassurance without suffocation, and they realize something uncomfortable. You weren't heavy, you were healing. They just weren't ready to receive it. While they're quietly comparing, you're transforming. And this is where the control shifts completely. When they left, they believed they controlled the narrative. They believed they dictated the ending. But healing is the ultimate plot twist. You begin to understand your worth differently. You start recognizing the red flags you once rationalized, the emotional breadcrumbs you accepted, the moments you shrank yourself to keep peace. And instead of internalizing their withdrawal as proof of your inadequacy, you start seeing it as proof of their limitation. That awareness is powerful. Because when you stop viewing their exit as abandonment and start viewing it as misalignment, something unlocks inside you. You reclaim dignity. You reclaim clarity. You reclaim emotional authority. And they feel that shift energetically, even if no words are exchanged. Avoidants thrive on emotional leverage, not always consciously, but it's embedded in the pattern. Distance becomes power, silence becomes strategy. But when you mirror that silence without resentment, when you detach without hostility, the leverage dissolves. They can't read you anymore. They can't predict you. They can't trigger you the same way. And unpredictability feels unsafe to someone who relies on control to feel secure. Suddenly, they're the ones wondering. They're the ones analyzing. They're the ones feeling the subtle anxiety of uncertainty. Because your silence isn't wounded anymore. It's composed. It's grounded. And grounded detachment is far more intimidating than emotional chaos. Then comes the fear they rarely admit, the fear of being forgotten. Avoidants often operate from a hidden abandonment wound. They fear engulfment, yes, but they also fear irrelevance. They fear being replaceable even while treating others as replaceable. When they sense that your life is moving forward without them, something primal activates. Not necessarily love, not necessarily immediate regret, but awareness. Awareness that access to you is no longer automatic, that the emotional door they walked through might not reopen so easily. And that realization forces reflection. They start asking themselves questions they avoided before. Was it really too much? Or was it just too real? Did they sabotage something stable because chaos felt familiar? Did they mistake safety for suffocation? Those questions don't surface loudly. They whisper in quiet moments, in late-night thoughts, in unexpected waves of nostalgia. And here's the truth that ties all of this together. They didn't expect you to evolve. They expected you to wait. They expected you to remain emotionally available in the background. They expected the story to pause when they left. But you kept living. You kept growing. You kept rebuilding parts of yourself that were neglected while you were trying to understand them. And growth is magnetic, even from a distance, even without communication. They sense it. The grounded energy, the reduced reactivity, the subtle confidence that wasn't there before. And that confidence shifts the dynamic permanently. Because now, if they ever attempt to re enter your life, it won't be with the same advantage. The version of you they left no longer exists. And that is the consequence they didn't calculate. The emotional crash, the quiet watching, the comparisons, the loss of leverage, the fear of being forgotten. All of it builds into one undeniable realization. They thought they were escaping vulnerability, but what they actually escaped was growth. And in escaping growth, they lost depth. You were not a burden. You were an opportunity. An opportunity to heal attachment patterns. An opportunity to learn emotional consistency. An opportunity to experience secure connection. And instead of leaning in, they leaned out. Instead of communicating fear, they disguised it as detachment. Instead of confronting internal wounds, they projected them outward. But here's the shift that matters most to you. Their delayed awareness does not require your delayed healing. You don't have to pause your evolution while they process regret. You don't have to reopen doors just because they finally recognize your value. Their realization may come. It often does. But your transformation doesn't depend on it. The power of this story isn't whether they return. It's that you no longer need them to in order to feel whole. And that emotional independence, that's what truly unsettles someone who once believed you would always be waiting at the edge of their silence. Because now the energy has reversed. The one who snaked you is left sitting with unanswered questions. The one who underestimated you is left observing your rise. The one who expected pursuit is left navigating absence. And while they process privately, you stand publicly in your growth. Not performative, not vengeful, just evolved. And evolution is the consequence they never saw coming. And evolution is the consequence they never saw coming. Because eventually, awareness turns into something heavier. Regret. Not always loud. Regret. Not the kind that posts apologies or sends dramatic midnight confessions. Avoidant regret is quieter than that. It shows up in moments when distraction fails, when the new connection doesn't quite feel right, when they realize that peace without depth feels empty. They start to sit with the truth they tried to outrun. You weren't asking for too much. You were asking for consistency. You weren't overwhelming. You were emotionally present. And presence is confronting for someone who survives by keeping one foot out the door. The regret phase doesn't always look romantic. Sometimes it looks like defensiveness at first. They tell themselves you weren't compatible, that it would have ended anyway, that they did what was necessary. But the mind can only rationalize what the body still feels for so long. And the body remembers safety. It remembers the nervous system calming down when you reassured them. It remembers the comfort of knowing someone wasn't playing games. It remembers how rare it felt to be understood without being exposed. And those memories don't disappear just because they chose distance. This is the part where they begin testing the waters, not diving in, testing. A subtle reaction to your story, a casual message disguised as friendliness, a random check-in that feels almost innocent. They won't admit its vulnerability. They'll frame it as curiosity. But underneath that message is one question. Do I still have access? Because access was something they took for granted. Your emotional availability, your willingness to listen, your patience. They assumed it would remain intact even after betrayal. They assumed time would soften your boundaries while they figured themselves out. And when they finally circle back, whether it's weeks or months later, they are often shocked by what they encounter. You are not the same. You don't respond with urgency. You don't over-explain. You don't pour your heart out at the first sign of reconnection. Your tone is steady, grounded, almost detached, but not cold, just self-aware. And that difference unsettles them more than anger ever could. Because anger means you're still emotionally hooked. Composure means you've done the work. They didn't expect accountability. That's the next twist in the story. They expected comfort. They expected familiarity. They expected you to slide back into the role you once held. But instead, you hold a mirror, not aggressively, not cruelly, just honestly. You don't attack them. You don't shame them, but you also don't ignore what happened. You reference patterns, you speak in clarity, you communicate boundaries, and accountability feels suffocating to someone who spent a lifetime avoiding it. When you calmly say what hurt you, it forces them to sit with it. When you explain how their silence impacted you, it disrupts their narrative. Because avoidants often rewrite history to protect themselves. They minimize the depth, they downplay the bond, they convince themselves it wasn't that serious. But your grounded truth challenges that illusion. An illusion was always their safety net. Some of them retreat again at this stage, not because they don't feel something, but because growth requires discomfort. And discomfort has always been their exit signal. They might say, "You've changed." They might hint that things feel different. And they're right, things are different. Because you no longer accept emotional half steps disguised as effort. But some of them stay just long enough to feel the weight of what they almost lost permanently. And that's when the what if begins echoing louder. What if they had leaned in instead of pulling away? What if they had communicated instead of strategized? What if they had chosen courage over control? Those questions don't always get spoken out loud, but they linger. Here's the truth. Most people don't tell you. Sometimes they come back for love, but sometimes they come back for validation. They want to know if they still matter, if they still hold emotional influence, if they can still re-enter your space without consequence. That's why discernment matters, because not every return is growth. Sometimes it's nostalgia mixed with ego. And this is where your evolution becomes your protection. You can feel the difference now. You can sense whether the energy is sincere or self-serving. Before, you might have accepted crumbs because you feared losing them entirely. Now you understand that losing someone who cannot meet you fully is not loss. It's alignment. They didn't expect you to outgrow the version of yourself that tolerated inconsistency. They didn't expect you to detach without hatred. They didn't expect you to forgive internally without reopening access externally. That kind of strength doesn't scream. It doesn't seek revenge. It simply elevates. And elevation creates distance naturally. You start focusing on yourself in ways that feel quiet but powerful. Your routines change. Your mindset sharpens. You begin valuing peace over potential. You stop romanticizing someone's trauma as a reason to endure mistreatment. You realize that understanding someone's wounds does not obligate you to bleed for them. And they feel that shift even if they can't articulate it, because the energy is no longer the same. You're no longer trying to prove your worth. You're no longer overextending to maintain connection. You're no longer explaining your standards as if they're negotiable. And that grounded presence forces them into one of two realities: rise to meet you or watch you move forward without them. This is the lesson they never calculated. When they snaked you, they thought they were choosing freedom. They thought they were avoiding emotional pressure. They thought they were maintaining control. But what they were really doing was revealing their ceiling. And when you grow past someone's emotional ceiling, they can either expand or lose access. Regret deepens when they see you no longer reacting to breadcrumbs, when they realize their old tactics don't work, when silence no longer triggers anxiety in you, when distance no longer feels like abandonment, but clarity. That's when the power dynamic permanently shifts. Because now, if they walk away again, you won't collapse. And they know it. If they hesitate, you won't chase, and they feel it. If they attempt to re-enter casually, you won't dismantle your boundaries to accommodate them. And that awareness forces them into unfamiliar territory, accountability or absence. And here's the most important part for you listening to this. Their realization does not erase your experience. Their regret does not undo the nights you questioned yourself. Their curiosity does not restore the emotional safety they disrupted. You are allowed to evolve beyond someone's delayed awareness. You are allowed to choose peace over history. You are allowed to recognize that someone understanding your value late does not obligate you to offer it again. Because at the core of this entire story is one truth: they underestimated your resilience. They thought betrayal would weaken you. It refined you. They thought silence would break you. It strengthened your discernment. They thought distance would secure their advantage. It exposed their fear. And now, whether they return or remain distant, the outcome is the same. You are no longer the person they left behind. You are steadier. You are clearer. You are emotionally sovereign. And the one who tried to outmaneuver your heart is left facing something they never prepared for, a version of you that does not need their validation to thrive. That is the twist. That is the consequence. And that is what they didn't expect. But the story doesn't end at power shifting. It doesn't end at regret. It doesn't even end at their return or their silence. The final layer of this transformation is deeper than them. It's about what this experience unlocked inside you. Because when someone snakes you, when someone studies your softness and then uses distance as a weapon, it does something to your nervous system. It shakes your trust. It makes you question your intuition. You replay the memories, wondering where you missed the sign. You question your judgment. You wonder if you were naive. And for a moment, that self-doubt feels heavier than the betrayal itself. But here's what slowly begins to happen. You start trusting yourself again. You realize your intuition wasn't wrong. It was just overridden by hope. You sensed the pulling away. You noticed the emotional shifts. You felt the inconsistency. You just chose patience over panic. You chose empathy over ego, and there is nothing foolish about loving with patience. The only mistake would have been staying once clarity arrived. That clarity becomes your foundation now. You no longer ignore red flags disguised as they just need time. You no longer romanticize emotional unavailability as mysterious depth. You no longer chase closure from someone who avoids accountability. You become observant, not anxious, aware. And awareness is powerful. Because now, when you reflect on what happened, you don't just see the betrayal, you see the pattern. The slow fade, the strategic detachment, the ego preservation. You see how they kept one foot out the door while keeping you emotionally invested. And instead of internalizing that as proof that you weren't enough, you recognize it as proof that they weren't ready. That realization softens the resentment. Not because what they did didn't hurt, but because you understand it differently. Avoidants don't snake people because they are evil masterminds. They snake when they feel exposed, when intimacy threatens the identity they built around independence, when love begins demanding emotional responsibility. And if they've never learned how to sit inside vulnerability without running, they default to escape. You are not the problem. You are the mirror. And mirrors are uncomfortable when you're not ready to see yourself. This final phase is where emotional sovereignty locks in for you, because you stop needing them to admit what happened. You stop needing an apology to validate your pain. You stop needing them to circle back for you to feel chosen. You choose yourself. And choosing yourself looks different now. It looks like boundaries that don't require explanation. It looks like walking away the moment inconsistency appears. It looks like no longer confusing potential with reality. It looks like understanding that chemistry without consistency is chaos. And as you grow into this version of yourself, something unexpected happens. Compassion replaces bitterness. You begin to see that their avoidance wasn't a strategy to destroy you. It was a strategy to protect themselves. A flawed one, a harmful one, but rooted in fear, not superiority. And that perspective frees you. Because when you understand that someone's inability to love you correctly is about their limitations, not your worth, you stop shrinking to make them comfortable. You stop negotiating your needs. You stop proving your value. You simply embody it. Now here's the final twist in this story, the part that truly closes the loop. One day, whether it's through direct contact or silent observation, they will see you fully detached, not reactive, not performative, not trying to show them what they lost, just genuinely moved on. Grounded, secure, content. And in that moment, something clicks. They realize the access is gone. Not because you hate them, not because you're trying to punish them, but because you outgrew the version of love they were offering. That realization is heavy. Because it forces them to confront something deeper than regret. It forces them to confront capacity. They may finally understand that you weren't asking for too much, you were asking for the bare minimum of emotional consistency, and they couldn't meet it. Some will use that awareness to grow. Some will retreat further into avoidance. But either way, your journey no longer depends on their outcome. You see, the real power in this entire experience is not that they regret losing you. It's that you no longer fear losing them. That's emotional freedom. When you don't have to control the narrative, when you don't have to monitor their actions, when you don't have to decode mixed signals, when you don't feel anxious about silence, when you don't chase clarity from someone who thrives in ambiguity, you become calm. And calm is magnetic. Calm is powerful. Calm is unshakable. They may look back at what happened and think they outplayed you at first. They may remember how composed they were during the exit, how strategic the detachment felt, how confident they seemed walking away. But the real story unfolded after that. While they were protecting their ego, you were rebuilding your identity. While they were distracting themselves, you were reflecting. While they were testing replacements, you were elevating your standards. And elevation is not loud, it's quiet, consistent, intentional. It's choosing peace over proving a point. It's refusing to let betrayal turn you bitter. It's loving deeply again, but this time with discernment. Because the goal was never to become cold. The goal was to become conscious. And you did. So when you think back to the moment you realized they snaked you, you might still feel a sting. That's normal. You invested your heart. You believed in the connection. You saw potential. And losing potential hurts. But now, layered over that sting is strength. You survived something that once felt like emotional collapse. You faced abandonment without abandoning yourself. You processed betrayal without becoming it. And you transformed. That transformation is the true ending. Not whether they come back. Not whether they apologize. Not whether they finally understand your value. But whether you understand it. And you do now. You understand that your vulnerability was courage, not weakness. You understand that your consistency was maturity, not neediness. You understand that your desire for clarity was stability, not pressure. And once you know those truths, no one can snake you the same way again. Because you no longer hand your emotional power to someone who hasn't proven they can hold it. You no longer confuse avoidance with mystery. You no longer interpret distance as depth. You see it clearly. And clarity is freedom. So if you're listening to this and you're still in the early stages, still hurting, still confused, still replaying everything, hear this. You were not played because you were foolish. You were played because you were open. And openness is strength when paired with boundaries. What they didn't expect was your evolution. What they didn't expect was your silence turning into self-respect. What they didn't expect was your pain turning into power. And what they will never fully understand is how much stronger you became because they underestimated you. That's the full circle. They snaked you, but you awakened. And awakening is something no one can take back.